We want to continue today our discussion, part 5, on worldview, or cultural explanations of life and death. The key ideas that we're going to cover today include worldview. What is a worldview? How is worldview connected with culture? The manifestations of worldview, which include, of course, religion, and an overview of at least 6 of the major religions in the world. You might recall from our last set of discussions that when we talked about the 3 major deep influences and deep structures that influence culture, the indoctrination and culturalization process, they were the family, which we talked about in discussion part 2. They were the state, which we talked about as we talked about the various histories and how histories of various cultures and countries, political countries, would affect perhaps the cultural characteristics of individuals in those cultures today. And now today we're going to talk about worldview in terms of religion. And so that's what we want to look at with respect to this culture. So what is a worldview? The worldview of a people, according to Balian peoples, is the way the people interpret reality and events, including images of themselves and how they relate to the world around them. How am I interpreting reality and events, including images of myself, how I perceive myself, and how I relate to the world around me? Remember, of course, that meaning lies within people. It doesn't lie within words. Meaning lies within people. And although I might raise my voice when I'm speaking to someone, depending upon your perspective, you might think that my raising my voice means that I'm angry and I'm yelling at you. And yet other people, based on their perspectives, might also recognize that raising one's voice could equate to excitement and happiness. And it's because of our cultural upbringing that we have a tendency to try and interpret that and figure out how we're going to interpret it, because there's no straight right or wrong answers to these questions. So when we talk about what is a worldview, we're talking about the ideas that bring us to an understanding or a framework, a reference of thought that allows us to come to some grasp of understanding what is the purpose of life. That's a tough one. What is the purpose of life? Is the world ruled by law, by chance, or by God? What is the right way to live? How do I go about living, and how do I know? What are the origins of the universe, and how did life begin? A debate that's even recently been talked about and certainly hits hot buttons and had become very emotional issues with a lot of people as of recently. What happens when we die? What happens when we die? And again, with a lot of these, and how do we know? How do we know? What are the sources of knowledge? What is good? What is bad? What is right? And what is wrong? Thus, when we actually adopt a worldview, or a worldview, we're born into a worldview and enculturated into a worldview, whether it's a spirituality, a secular orientation, or a particular religious point of view, we're given instructions for daily life. How do we live our lives, and how do we find meaning? Meaning lies within people, not within words and such. Worldview provides us with an interpretation, or a way of interpreting how we look at life. And as a consequence, we see that across cultures and across different worldviews, we find very drastically different opinions, perspectives, and explanations of life and death and everything in between. So when we talk about worldview, how do we acquire it? Culture provides a large portion of an individual's worldview. We get it through culture. It refers to the manner in which a culture sees and expresses its relation to the world around it. How do I see and express the relation of worldview to the world around me? Worldview is imposed by collective wisdom as a basis for sanctioned actions and enables survival and adaptation. We talked about this before. Culture talks about, perhaps if I live on the coast and I grew up in a fishing culture, we often are interested in survival, and it might mean I have to learn how to do fishing. I become a fisherman. If I live in the mountains, I might have to learn how to pick berries and the like. If I live in flatlands, farming becomes important to the lifestyle. Same thing holds true here. We might suggest from culture to culture that this often represents what we might recognize as common sense. We might suggest that this actually develops what we call common sense. Because from culture to culture, as we've often talked about, we call it common sense. How can you not know this? Well, we know it because, whatever the topic might be, because we were enculturated into it. This was part of our culture, and it was part of our daily living. And people who didn't grow up in our culture, we might accuse of not having common sense, when in fact, they have just a different form because they come from different perspectives and worldviews. So what we might call common sense, remember common, if we look at the idea of common, it's across the culture. And there are different survival skills and adaptations that are required based on where a culture started and grew. So when we talk about the manifestations of worldview, worldview deals with how people perceive the world and communicate within it. And because of that, if we understand a person's worldview or a culture's worldview, we are able to reasonably predict approximate behaviors and motivations for action. We're able to reasonably predict how they might respond to certain things. A link between worldview and behavior are seen in a culture, and this is also seen in the business arena. How do people do business? For example, how do I function with my religious and philosophical beliefs when I'm trying to conduct trade and commerce? These beliefs are foundational to role perceptions, behavior codes, ethics, and how economic activities are conducted. Think about this for a moment. One of the examples that we've discussed is that idea between the environmentalist and the Christian adhering to strict world views here and how they look at the planet. Now, the environmentalist will suggest to you that the earth should be cared for by man and it needs to be paid close attention to and as such cultivated for future generations. Not an unreasonable on the face of it, and yet Christian texts, specifically the Bible, suggest that man is to be master over the planet and all the creatures thereof. That's a completely different perspective in how I might treat the planet. Can they come up with a harmonious balance between them? Possibly, but it depends on how strict of an adherence one versus the other has toward their particular worldview. So all life's important questions, life, death, various ways of knowing, are addressed, and they're not always similar. So constructs of worldview in brief. We're going to look at three of them. Religion as a worldview, secularism as a worldview, and spirituality as a worldview. When we talk about religion, we're going to talk about 6 of the traditional religious values, religious traditions that exist in the world. Secularism, however, traces its roots back to ancient China, classical Greece and Rome, classical Greek philosophy, Plato, where secularism rejects the idea, for example, of miracles, embraces the idea of science, comes up with a set of ethical standards based on humanism. Death is final. Why? Essentially because there's no evidence, scientific evidence, to suggest an afterlife with respect to a secular point of view, secular worldview. Supernatural beings that the various religions might refer to as God are rejected in a secular view. When we talk about religion, we're talking about a core belief in the existence and a reality of something greater, a greater presence, a greater being than human beings themselves. And this greater being, however it's described, is looked to for guidance and potentially salvation. Those are very different and opposing views right off the bat. Spirituality, as a worldview, has a tendency to kind of divide that down the middle in some respects. It's very popular in the United States right now in our popular culture because it's very personalized. And remember, when we talked about our discussions on U.S. history, for instance, that U.S. history is characterized by individuality and the ability to do things for ourselves and to accomplish for ourselves. And so spirituality is all about self-discovery being important, where we think not only about what we are, but what we choose. And choice is important here, what we choose to be. We can learn to value silence, solitude, and quiet meditation because this is where we learn and look within ourselves for answers. We practice mindfulness. We learn to observe the environment and how you behave when you are in that environment. Engaging in creative self-expression, we connect ourselves to activities such as yoga, dance, music, and other such activities that allow us to get into ourselves and build up ourselves and our own set of wisdom. And oftentimes it's about seeking simplicity in lifestyle. Some of the goals are the same as those when we discuss religion, such as inner peace, a link with nature, and of course a search for meaning in life. So, why are we even looking at worldviews? One, this is an intercultural communication course. It's through understanding these worldviews, as we start looking at the religions specific, that we need to recognize that religious worldviews, spirituality worldviews, secular worldviews, if we don't have a good grasp of them, we're going to have a very difficult time trying to figure out how to really, truly, effectively communicate with people who have a different perspective than our own. We need to realize that there are indeed people out there who have a different perspective than our own. And by understanding some of these things, we can start to build some links, some bridges to communication, understanding. And if the question of harmony exists, it can only exist if we have some sort of understanding of each other. And let's face it, it is through a recent lack of understanding and a spread of ignorance through media frenzy that causes such misunderstanding as to develop some violent reactions to people who have different worldviews, different religious views than our own. So let's talk about religion. The word religion itself comes from the Latin word religare, which means to tie. We might look at it as suggesting that through religion, that particular worldview ties all of life's existence and the human condition together. With respect to the sacred, religion provides explanations as values to the unexplainable. Death. What happens after death? Why do good people suffer bad consequences in life? It provides principles and beliefs for issues regarding the nature of life, the nature of death. Also provides us with a rules guide, if you will, to our own personal conduct. Responds to basic human need to understand the purpose of life. We live in a social world populated by other human beings. It allows us to begin to develop norms of understanding and behavior so that we can get along with those other human beings. Religion in the 21st century is very global. It travels. And with the globalization of technology and transportation, it permeates every aspect of society in every corner of the globe. We can't separate religion across political country boundaries anymore. And as a result, we wind up with a lot of people engaged in a lot of conflict. Now there's the paradox, isn't it? Most religions, at their origin, preach about peace and harmony while engaging in bloody wars, or have been engaged in bloody wars within their history. Paton states that the study of religion prepares us to encounter not only other centers and calendars and numerous versions of the sacred and profane, but also to decipher and appreciate different modes of language and behavior. So what are common elements of all religions? 1, speculation. Religions help to explain the unexplainable. Why bad things happen to good people, reasons for life, and comprehension of death, etc. 2, sacred writings. Most of major religions have sacred writings, and most of them will express themselves as having been divinely inspired. And these sacred writings usually include teachings and stories, etc. Religious rituals, because it is through rituals that members of a religion recall and reaffirm important beliefs. And this is what we call living our beliefs out loud. They reintroduce collective social behavior. They connect and reinforce social bonds. And most religions will actually have, when we talk about regulating behavior, what is good behavior, what is bad behavior, most religions have some version of the Golden Rule. And of course, we know the Golden Rule, at least in one reading of it, to be to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Most religions repeat that in some phraseology and variety, but the idea is still there. So why are we going to cover Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism? Because number one, it's the numbers that they have throughout the world, or their diffusion throughout the world. They may be scattered and have made some significant impacts in the world. Or they're very relevant because they've made impact in the social world. I am not a theologian. Let's go ahead and put that on the table. I'm not going to go ahead and tell you that I'm an expert on these religions, but I am going to tell you that part of what we're looking at discussing today is that we want to talk about how these religions get acted out in the social environment, and thus how it affects their communicative behavior. So let's look at Christianity, and you will see as we start talking about almost all major religions that there is a central figure, a person of some sort that lies in the middle of many of these. And so as we start looking at these broad strokes, let's look at Christianity. When you look at Christianity, some estimates put the denominations of various Christian beliefs and various religions that claim to be Christian at over 33,000. Historically, there are three branches: the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Protestantism, which in Protestantism I'm going to include such as Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, and others. One of the things that Christianity has in common is that it can be described as a living, ever-changing religion which owes its vitality to its diversity. But it does indeed hold a number of core beliefs amongst all of the denominations. The first being that there is a single God who created the universe and also gave the world his only Son, Jesus Christ, who gave his life on the cross. As such, the gravest problem in human life is sin. Christianity is a total worldview that includes both the religious and the secular dimensions of life, because Jesus lived among the people and he suffered, so he understands human pain, problems, and enticements. Man and woman are created in God's image, and God is a very personal God. Now, beyond that, most of the Christian denominations will begin to differ. Cultural expressions of Christianity include the first component, that being of community. And it's an essential component. Fellowship through the church is important and also then fosters communication, doesn't it? And a very specific kind of communication. Christianity is also concerned with individuals. Individuals are not only unique, they have a unique and individual relationship with God. And we can change both ourselves, and by changing ourselves, we change the world. And many denominations within the Christian religion will suggest that our own actions and our own deeds provide the ultimate evidence for judgment and potential salvation. And because our own deeds are that potential, Christianity often stresses the doing, the action, and as such, hard work is valued. We also are a very future-oriented religion, because what's the eye on the prize issue? The afterlife and the salvation. And so, with that in mind, that guides the actions of most Christians. And the afterlife then brings with it the idea of eternal heaven or the eternal hell. As Jesus consorted with ostracized groups, we might know them as out-groups, and come up with all sorts of names for them, Christians are also called to do the same and reach out to those less advantaged. How does that compare with Judaism? Now, mind you, there are fewer than 14 million Jews worldwide. However, worldly influence based on contributions in politics, literature, education, medicine, finance, and the law make it well worth our time to pay attention to Judaism, because this influence has been around for thousands of years. The central figure in Judaism is Abraham. Abraham is considered the father of the Jewish people. As a consequence, they consider themselves the chosen people. And with the chosen people title and a special covenant with God, it brings with it increased responsibility and consequently increased hardships. What are the core beliefs? One universal and eternal God, the creator and sovereign of all that exists. Each person must be obedient to the God-given commandments in the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Bible. Humans are inherently pure and good and are given free will, slightly different than the Christian start of life, where humans are inherently pure and good and are given free will. Christians will suggest that humans are born with what is considered original sin that needs to be cleaned and purified. Humans can live any way they choose and have only to bear the consequences. You are responsible for your actions, and as such also responsible for the consequences of your actions. You can see here that we're getting at the consequences of actions. How do I live my life? There are laws. I choose my actions. I suffer the consequences or rewards. We're talking about those similarities. There are 3 branches of Judaism. First one being the Orthodox, retains as much as possible from the traditional religious teachings found in classical and ancient writings. This is probably the most conservative branch. And then there's also a Reform, which is an attempt in the late 18th century to modernize many of the long-established Jewish practices so that Jews worldwide could assimilate into non-Jewish communities without losing their Jewish identity. And these might be things in the Reform like prayer in modern languages, allowing both men and women to sit together when they pray, having women religious leaders, and music being allowed. The third branch is the conservative Judaism. Many believe that the rules, rituals, and traditions of Orthodox practice are necessary if Jewish identity is to be maintained. Now here we're talking about splitting it down the middle. And for most of these, there's no central religious authority that any of these branches specifically answer to. What about the cultural expressions? What probably has shaped these people, those that are of the Jewish faith? 1, opposition and persecution. Oppression, genocide, and persecution in history. Now think about this. The hardiness of a people that perhaps had to live through persecution from Egyptian pharaohs, Roman armies, the Spanish Inquisition, the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther at his time actually insisted that all Jews convert to Christianity. Adolf Hitler in World War II. And today, there's even very serious open hostility from the Middle East towards Jews and Israel. So it is no wonder that Jews have a hard time trusting non-Jews. Jews have often stressed education and learning throughout their history. Wisdom is better than jewels. And so they have made serious impacts in education, medicine, law, and literature. As a result of much of this, justice becomes a big theme to ensure the moral treatment of others. Probably deeply related to the centuries of mistreatment and persecution. Family becomes a big metaphor, kind of closing the ranks. who can you trust if there's always some outside persecution throughout history that has indeed happened? You trust the family. And so family metaphors are central to the culture. The immediate family becomes probably the locus for all of what cultural teaching is about. What about death? Death here is a natural process. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, have no clear reference to an afterlife at all. And the role of the family and the community is important, and as such, responsibility for the Jewish community is to this life, not to the next. And you might already begin to perceive that would give a slightly different perspective and worldview as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. If my perspective was to this life because there was no promise of a next. Let's flip and talk a little bit about Islam. In the West, as you well or may not know, perceptions of the Islamic faith are often colored by hysteria, generalizations, and oversimplifications. You can thank the media for most of that. In truth, the realities of Muslims can indeed be as diverse as those of Christians. If we look at the facts, the Muslim religion is probably no more prone to violence than any other religion. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's amazing, Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, or otherwise, how the name of religion is often used to justify political violence. Whether or not you agree with these sentiments, it doesn't really matter. Because one of the things we need to recognize is that you need a basic understanding of Islam to be effective in your intercultural communication within this particular century, because Islam is very populous and it's quite impactful. So how did it start? Its origins come from Muhammad, who received a revelation from God in 610 CE. Came through the Archangel Gabriel. He is responsible, Muhammad is responsible for then recording these revelations in the Quran. The messages established a social order that was to become Islam. Now here the community and the religion became one. If the community and the religion became one, you can already understand why in some cases it becomes very difficult to understand the concept of the separation of church and state. Muhammad established the city-state of Medina, which now lies within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And it is through missionary zeal of Islam that helped it spread throughout the world. The core beliefs, one God. That God is Allah. Allah creates and controls everything. A belief in angels. Angels are a symbol of God's power. And the angels also worship the one God. The Quran, which is the sacred text of Muslims, which is considered the final, the perfect, and the complete Word of God. Submission. Muslims consider themselves as submitting to God and His will. Predestination. God is aware of everything. God is the creator of everything. God has documented all that has happened. And whatever God wills to happen, happens. And whatever He wills not to happen, does not happen. In Arabic, there is a phrase that Muslims will often recite, which is which goes inshallah, which basically means if God wills it. Nothing happens that God doesn't already know about. And then finally, judgment. This life is given to you to prepare for Judgment Day, where you wind up going either to eternal paradise or eternal hell. And the Quran says about judgment, and those who believe and do good deeds, they are the dwellers of paradise, and they dwell therein forever. The Quran also states, and whoever seeks a religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from him, and he will be one of the losers in the hereafter. Zeal, very similar to that of Christians in some respects. And the Quran also states, those who have disbelieved and died in disbelief, the earth full of gold would not be accepted from any of them if it were offered as a ransom. They have a painful punishment, and they will have no helpers. So, upon Judgment Day, the scales are balanced. And the question about whether or not good deeds of the individual have outweighed the bad deeds becomes paramount. If good deeds are outweighing the bad deeds, what is the goal of life? Obviously, to continue committing good deeds. Islam's core beliefs include the 5 pillars of Islam, which unites Muslims as a family of believers. And those 5 pillars include the statement of belief, which affirms that there is only one God and his prophet is Muhammad. Prayer, 5 times daily, and most Muslims all over the world, during those 5 times of prayer will face Mecca, the holy city in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia currently. And in fact, when I spent my time in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the whole country, bells get sounded throughout the whole country 5 times a day, and the whole country stops to go pray. Alms, giving alms to the poor. Everything is under God's care. Combine that with the need for good deeds being fruitful over the number of bad deeds, and you can see why they attempt to have a community of equals and take care of those who are less fortunate than themselves. Fasting, spiritual self-discipline is obtained in fasting. It allows for reflection and allows for continuation of good works. This happens mostly through the month of Ramadan. And then finally, the 5th pillar of belief, the 5th pillar of Islam here is pilgrimage. Any able-bodied individual who happens to be of the Muslim faith is required, if they are financially able and physically able, to make the pilgrimage or the Hajj to Mecca in Saudi Arabia at least once in their lifetime. Cultural expressions of Islam. First is their response to the jihad, which is a really culturally loaded term, isn't it? Many of us in the West think of jihad as something that is outwardly violent against everybody who isn't Muslim. Gotta love those who have taken and usurped the religion in the name of politics and political violence. Jihad, as you may already know at this point, refers to 2 different kinds of struggles. The first being the inner struggle of oneself to try and truly submit to God and follow the practices of Islam. And the other, an outward struggle that is designed to either defend Islam or to further its causes. And that is probably the part that has often been twisted more than anything else. Islam is also a complete way of life. There's no distinction between religion and society, and governs all affairs, both public and private. The Sharia law was written as a result of controlling government and the law of society based on the religion. This is not unlike, oftentimes, where various Christian nations are trying to then also suggest that there is no separation of church and state, and that Christian nations ought to be controlled strictly by Christian law. Gender. Gender roles are in a state of flux in many Islamic countries. there are strict teachings that suggest men are stronger in every way, and that women then need to be protected and serve and submissive. These roles are changing. And they're changing probably because of globalization, technology, etc. Islamic notions about death, again, judgment, reward, and punishment are key themes. There is a description of the afterlife, paradise, and a description of hell. There is a day of judgment, when people will be resurrected for God's judgment according to their beliefs and according to their deeds. And so we're talking about a focus, again, on the future. And I should be doing things in this life to prepare for the next. Let's talk about Hinduism. In Hinduism, there are over 1 billion followers. It's probably the world's oldest religion that we know of today. Hinduism lacks both a single canonical text accepted by all the followers, and it also lacks an elite group of people who exert control over the development of its fundamental beliefs and practices. So there's no central founder or no central authority. Most historians trace the origins of Hinduism to a time 4,000 years ago, when a group of light-skinned Aryan Indo-European tribes invaded what is now northern India. Aryans moved into the Indus Valley. A blending of cultures took place, and since as they mixed with native peoples, they shared customs, traditions, rites, symbols, and myths. Movement spread by the communication of sacred texts. I said there was no central text, but there are a number of texts. Those sacred texts include the Vedas, which is the oldest, most foundational scriptures, might be interpreted as the hearing. The Upanishads, which is prose and verse, which talks about the role of social contemplation and meditation. The Bhagavad Gita, which are 3 courses, and these are lengthy dialogues between a warrior and a god, talking specifically about and referred to as the discipline of knowledge, the discipline of action, and the discipline of devotion. God is within us. The divine is within us. And it is through the practice of inspiration, meditation, etc., that we can therefore rise above mortal limitations and do things that are above and beyond for the benefit of society. So what are the core beliefs of Hinduism? 1, divine is in everything. There is an interconnectedness across time and space. All things are connected, and God is in every object. God is in every object. There is an ultimate reality. The physical world is not the only reality. Perception, how we see things, is merely an illusion. There is a struggle to unite the inner self and the ultimate reality. And this is oftentimes where seeking within ourselves becomes that much more important. That ultimate reality is called a Brahm. It's the ultimate level of reality where there is a philosophical absolute. It is serenely blissful and beyond all ethical and metaphysical limitations. God involves infinite being, consciousness, and bliss. And there are multiple paths to this reality. Multiple paths. So there's not one direct prescribed path, as in other religions where there might be. And because of the varied and multiple conglomeration of religious thought within Hinduism, these paths are distinctly sometimes different, varied, but all divine. So what are the cultural expressions of Hinduism? It is a complete way of life. pervades every part of a person's life, from sleeping to walking to eating to thinking. Dharma is a very important concept here. This is how people live and treat each other. This is where we might get into the idea of duty, law, justice, etc. Remember, the next life here is also about reward or punishment. And it all depends on how we treat each other now. Karma is a reaction and action can have good or bad consequences, and these can be long-term consequences. And that there are 4 stages in life. The student stage, where our specific responsibilities might be to study. The householder stage, where we have ethical family obligations, where we're raising a family. Past the family might be the forest dweller stage, where our main focus at this point would be on meditation and seeking within. And finally, for men, specifically, where we attempt to be united with the Brahman. Brahm is the key in all ethical metaphysical limitations, the aesthetic stage. So what are the notions about death in Hinduism? The soul is immortal. And there is such a thing as reincarnation. And as such, if there is reincarnation, Hindus learn not to fear death or to grieve over the death of loved ones like we do in Western society and Western cultures. A person's soul does not die, but passes into another reincarnation. And if lessons are learned, that reincarnation is a step closer to the divine, to the blissful. So death is more easily accepted because it's recognized much more as a transition. Let's talk about Buddhism. Again, the central figure exists here as well. In Buddhism, it's Buddha who is the person who has epitomized the human situation. Buddhism was founded by an Indian prince named Siddhartha Gautama. He became known as the Enlightened One, or Buddha, and until his death at 80 in 483 BCE, Buddha traveled throughout the Ganges Valley, sharing his insights with anyone who would listen to him. Today, Buddhism is small in number, about 400 million, yet its societal impact is quite profound. The appeal here is that it is founded on reason, so nearly secularism in some respects, and not on faith. Buddha is known as having said, "I am not a god, but a man." And that his thought was that a belief in a god actually held people back from their own growth. A belief in a god actually held people back from their own personal growth. All individuals have the potential to seek truth on their own, not necessarily believe what some clergy just tells them must be true and therefore accepted. There are 4 noble truths that are often looked at in Buddhism. And they are, number 1, life is suffering. All in life is impermanent and unstable. Things change. And people suffer. Number 2, much of the suffering is caused by craving, self-desire, attachment, anger, envy, greed, ignorance, and self-delusion. Acceptance is the key. Because suffering has a cause, it can be eliminated. We need to stop clinging to things so that we can achieve nirvana or enlightenment. The remedy to this is the 8-fold plan. And it is by your own efforts that you are able to awaken yourself, watch yourself, and live joyfully because you are your own master. What is that method of the Eightfold Plan? It's divided into 3 parts. There are eight pieces here that are divided in 3 parts. The first one is wisdom. The first third is wisdom, the first 2 parts. And this is the right view, is attaching a correct understanding and accepting the reality and origins of suffering and the ways leading to the cessation of suffering. In other words, acceptance. Number 2, having a right purpose. Being free from ill will, cruelty, and untruthfulness toward the self and others. We need to discard bad thinking and develop love and compassion. The second major division here is ethical conduct, where we need to pay attention to the third point of the 8, right speech. We need to be truthful and considerate of others. Right action, where we need to be moral, honorable, and conduct peaceful behavior. The 5th, right livelihood. Avoid occupation that harms human beings and other living things. And the third section here, mental discipline, or points 6, 7, and 8 of the Eightfold Plan. Right efforts, cultivating and maintaining wholesome thoughts. Wholesome thoughts. 7, right mindfulness, focus on the here and now. Manage the mind. And 8, right concentration. Aim for calm, a very calm and peaceful, focused mind. Cultural expressions of Buddhism, the use of silence. Language can be deceptive, misleading. Well, if meanings are in people and not in words, the language itself can be an obstacle. So peace comes from within. We need to listen to ourselves, and we can only do that in our silence. Impermanency, all is in flux. Recognize that and be adjustable and flexible to change. And also recognize karma. Our actions have consequences. You determine with your own free will, your own karma. Good actions and good behavior produces good results, according to karma. So what are the Buddhist notions about death? A large portion of Buddhist teaching focuses on death. It's inevitable. A person is reborn. Where we end one chapter, we start another, karma takes over. Past karma is rebirth itself. A person's past deeds play a role. How many times he or she is reborn? Evil people keep coming back because they have lessons to continually learn. Once there is enough good karma, a person will experience nirvana and there is no need to come back. It's all about learning. It's all about lessons. Okay, let's talk about Confucianism. Confucianism is not thought of as a formal religion. It's a system of social, political, ethical, and religious thought, but it's based on the teachings of Confucius and his successors. There is no formal hierarchy, no priesthood, and almost no congregational life where people get together and perform ritual relative and specific to Confucius practices. Confucius was born in 551 BCE. And what Confucius taught grew out of his observations about the human condition in China during his lifetime. Confucius asserted that government must be founded on virtue, and that all citizens must be attentive to the duties of their position. Social order and harmony. 3,000 people came to study under him, and over 70 became well-established scholars. So what are the core beliefs of Confucianism? Number 1, People are basically good and only have to learn what constitutes correct behavior through education and self-reflection. Number 2, by education, even a common man can become superior. 3, there was a deep commitment to social harmony. Proper human relationships are a basis of society. And so, a commitment to social harmony also includes fulfilling obligations to family and society and honoring the upper members of society, the son to the father, minister, ruler, wife to the husband, etc. The sacred writings are the sayings of Confucius, or the Analects. These were put together in a 50-year period and consisted of about 20 books. And they were compiled by Confucius's followers. And in these sayings, stories, and proverbs, they all address things like respect, honor, piety, duty, humanity, and ritual. So what are the cultural expressions of Confucianism? Humanism, for one, where reciprocity was focused on. A deep respect for others to avoid conflict and stress harmony. Again, doing unto others, right? Rituals, rites, proprieties, and conventions. Outward expressions of good manners is what that comes down to. Outward expression of good manners. Power. Power must be used for the common good. The arts. A means of peace and moral education. Confucianism teaches empathy. It encourages an understanding and a fellowship with others. It encourages an understanding and awareness of status and role relationships. If relationships are the basis for society, then roles are vitally important to the harmony of that society. An awareness of social etiquette, ritual, and social protocol. And Confucianism encourages the use of indirect language. Intercultural communication, we're talking to somebody who happens to be a Confucius follower. We're talking about indirect language, which means they will be hesitant to directly ask for things so that they can save face of yours for having to refuse and theirs for asking for something that will not be granted. So things like requests are often implied rather than stated. And that's common practice for their communication. The saving of face. How about the Confucian notions about death? Confucius wasn't interested in death. He figured there was too much to pay attention to learning how to survive and live comfortably and harmoniously in this life. And the focus was on this life. Strive to live the best possible life while here on earth. That's where the focus needs to be. Confucius urged his followers to engage in formal practices ranging from funerals to the building of small family shrines to honor the dead, but didn't really talk about what happened after death. All right, so that talks about, we've covered the 6 major worldviews that are considered the 6 major religions in the world today. Worldview is a culture's orientation, we talked about this, toward God, toward humanity, nature, the universe, life, death, sickness, and other issues concerning existence. And although worldview is communicated in a variety of ways, such as secularism, spirituality, religion is predominant, and it's a predominant element of culture, which one's worldview is derived. If we have a better understanding of the various worldviews in existence, it's a whole lot easier for us to be able to approximate a prediction of people's reactions and behavior to world events. And it's also easier for us to more effectively communicate with others. One of our greatest social issues today in the 21st century is what? there are many, many people around the planet who do not welcome bilingual or multicultural approaches to God. And as such, that's a major cause of religious and spiritual beliefs being where they clash, that collision where violence has a tendency to take place. This spills over far too often into politics. And far too often political agendas are blamed or credited to religion as its source and cause. And so religion is often used as a rallying cry for political agendas and violence. Good intercultural communication requires a broad understanding of these very religious worldviews. If we don't have that broad understanding, if harmony can exist in the world between all of these worldviews, it's not going to take place unless we have good intercultural communication and a good understanding of where the other's worldview has originated from and where it comes from. I can't emphasize the importance of an open mind here as to leading to understanding. One is not suggesting you change your worldview to any of these individual worldviews as a result, but greater understanding will indeed lead to more effective communication. All right, if you will.